Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine trying to disappear online, right? Not by going offline, but
Yeah.
by looking exactly like everyone else.
Uh-huh. Like perfect digital camouflage.
Exactly. So perfect that, malicious activity just blends seamlessly into all the normal, everyday internet traffic. That's the fascinating space we're diving into today.
And what's really interesting, I think, is this strategic shift it
Yeah.
represents. It's not just about like getting initial access anymore.
Right.
The focus is really intense on persistence, on communication methods that prioritize stealth and resilience above almost everything else.
Yeah, totally. So we're getting a deep dive into what the sources we're calling the C2 frameworks lay out as a pro-level approach to stealth in red team operations.
Yeah.
This is specifically about command and control, or that vital lifeline back to a compromised system.
And if we connect that to the bigger picture for a sec, C2 is basically how an operator stays in control, right?
Yeah.
How they interact with a target system after they've already got that initial foothold.
So issuing commands, pulling data,
Exactly. Seeing what's happening inside the network, all through that C2 channel.
and the mission for this deep dive, for you listening, is really to give you a shortcut, a way to understand this pretty sophisticated, modern digital intrusion methodology without having to, wade through dense technical docs yourself.
Yeah. Cut through the noise.
We're going to unpack this whole workflow, what it does, what it can do, and crucially, how its unique design solves some major challenges that, the traditional methods often face.
Right.
We'll look at the distinct steps an operator actually takes versus what the underlying systems or tools handle automatically.
That's a key distinction. User versus system.
Definitely. We'll highlight the key components and show why it's built this way for maximum stealth and resilience.
And it really raises that important question. How do you maintain persistent access and communicate with a compromised system in a way that actively evades modern security defenses?
Yeah, the stuff that's looking for C2 traffic.
Exactly. And the C2 frameworks provide a very structured, pretty insightful answer to that. It focuses heavily on blending in with legitimate network traffic and, maybe more surprisingly, leveraging common infrastructure in pretty unexpected ways.
So what does this all really mean? It means looking at how attackers, or, okay, in this case, red teams operating under strict rules, are evolving their techniques.
Keeping up with the defenses.
It's about understanding how someone might try to move and communicate completely unseen, often right under the radar of traditional network monitoring.
And doing that by using common trusted services like, cloud infrastructure that everyone uses.
Right. It's a perspective shift that's just incredibly valuable for anyone trying to understand the modern digital threat landscape.
And that's the core principle the C2 frameworks really emphasized right from the get-go. Training at a pro level.
Okay.
It's about mastering these techniques so you're actually prepared for real-world engagements and you're not, as they put it, surprised by what's needed when you hit those environments with sophisticated defenses.
So it's not just about finding a hole or getting code execution. It's really everything that comes after that initial breach and doing it in a way that's both effective and incredibly stealthy. The sources are super clear on the non-negotiable key goals that drive every single decision in this specific workflow.
Yeah, they list these objectives as the absolute guiding principles. First, a really strict rule for that initial access phase. No implants left behind until proven compromise.
Whoa, okay. That's a significant constraint right there.
Yeah.
It tells you immediately, this isn't about just, dropping persistent malware the second you get in.
Well, it's cautious.
You prove your access first using temporary stuff.
Exactly. And that minimizes the risk, right, of leaving forensic artifact if that initial access is short-lived or maybe gets discovered quickly.
Makes sense.
Then the second goal speaks directly to that camouflage idea. Ensuring implant C2 traffic looks like normal cloud traffic, workers.dev.
Blending in by using a subdomain associated with a massive trusted cloud provider like Cloudflare.
Making the bad stuff look utterly mundane.
Okay, got it. What's next?
Third, protecting the operator and giving flexibility. C2 server is disposable and not tied to your real identity.
The burner concept, but for the infrastructure itself. If the server gets found, who cares? It's disposable, doesn't trace back to you personally.
Easy to spin up, easy to tear down, total isolation.
Right. And the last goal?
And finally, the exit strategy, designed for maximum cleanliness.
Yeah.
The implant can be easily cleaned up, ideally reboot only.
Wow. So the goals are crystal clear. Get in stealthily with temporary tools. Only commit to persistence once you're sure. Make your comms look like normal cloud traffic. protect yourself with disposable servers, and have an exit plan that leaves basically nothing behind.
That's a much, much higher bar for an operation than just, getting in and staying in.
It absolutely is. And to hit those demanding goals, the workflow described in the C2 frameworks isn't just like a collection of tools. It's a deliberate, structured, multi-phase process.
Right, it's a methodology. It dictates the sequence of actions and decisions.
It's basically a roadmap for a stealth operation. The sources break it down into these distinct phases, guiding the operator step by step.
Okay, so it starts with the pre-compromise phase, focused entirely on getting that initial access.
Then, building on that, there's a really crucial persistence decision point.
Which, if the answer is yes to persistence,
It leads to implant deployment. Makes sense.
then comes the really ingenious part, the C2 network design, which the sources specifically call the modern style.
Okay, I'm interested in that bit.
And of course, you can't forget the vital cleanup process.
Absolutely essential.
Mm.
And woven throughout every single phase, right? Not a separate step, but always there the critical OPSEC notes, operational security considerations.
Because your OPSEC has to be perfect at every single turn, one slip up.
Yeah, exactly. So this whole structure is deliberately designed to layer in stealth, bolster operational security, ensure disposability at each step, basically minimizing the chance of detection and increasing the operator's safety all the way through. All right, let's dive into that first step then. Phase 1, the pre-compromise phase. This is all about getting that initial foot in the door.
Yeah, and the goal here is very, very focused, as the C2 frameworks define it. You are basically there to gain initial access to the target system, number one.
Okay.
Number two, prove that code execution is possible within that specific environment.
Show you can actually run stuff.
Right. Then enumerate the target environment, figure out what you're dealing with, what's around you, and finally simply demonstrate access capabilities. Just show you're in and can do things.
And this is the big but. There's that absolutely critical constraint you mentioned right at the start from the core goals.
Yep.
This must be done without leaving any persistent artifacts on the system. The sources are incredibly strict here. No disk drops yet.
And this is where understanding the why is so important. Why this super strict limitation at the beginning?
Yeah, why?
The reasoning, as the C2 frameworks explain it, is actually simple but brilliant for stealth. By using temporary live tools, tools that reside only in memory or within an active session.
Okay, not saved to the hard drive.
Exactly. You ensure that if your initial way in gets discovered and shut down, or even if the target system just reboots for any reason, no traces of the intrusion remain on the disk.
Uh-huh. So the ultimate stealth move at the start is just to be completely temporary. Like being a ghost if you get caught, or the power cycles, boom, there's no physical evidence you were ever there, at least not in terms of files or system changes on the hard drive.
Precisely. It drastically reduces the risk of early detection because, file-based antivirus or endpoint detection systems won't find suspicious executables or scripts that you've dropped onto the file system.
Because you haven't dropped anything.
Right. You're operating entirely in the volatility of RAM.
Okay, so what kind of live tools are we actually talking about here? The sources give a few examples.
They mention tools that run purely in memory, within the context of that active session you've just established through your initial exploit, whatever that was.
Right.
Examples include tools that can give you a memory shell like SOCAT, or even the standard Linux bash shell, executed in a specific way to keep it in memory. Or maybe a meterpreter session, if you use Metasploit, initiated with a specific parameter like the -m style parameter, that basically tells it, hey, run entirely in memory.
So these aren't programs saved as files first. They execute and live solely within the computer's working memory, RAM.
Got it. You're essentially running a command line interface or maybe a simple utility directly in the computer's volatile memory, kind of hijacking the resources of an existing process rather than writing a new program file to the disk.
Correct. Another technique mentioned is setting up a reverse SSH tunnel out.
Okay, SSH, secure shell, right? This involves using the compromised system's own network capabilities to create a secure encrypted channel back to your operator machine.
And often, I guess, you'd try to make that tunnel go out over a legitimate, common, outgoing port, like port 443.
Exactly. The sources specifically call out using ports like 443, which is a standard port for secure web traffic, HTTPS. That port is almost always allowed outgoing through firewalls.
Yeah, has to be for web browsing.
Which makes the encrypted tunnel activity just blend in with normal web browsing traffic. You're essentially punching a secure encrypted connection back to yourself, using a port that looks perfectly normal to network monitoring tools that are maybe just inspecting destination ports.
Smart.
Well,
Using the network's own assumptions against it. Very clever.
and maybe the simplest form, if your initial exploit allows it, is just using an in-console shell during session.
Okay.
If you happen to compromise a service or an application in a way that gives you a command prompt or a shell directly within that vulnerable process, well, you just use that existing interface. You don't need to introduce any external tools at all.
Because it's already live and running in memory as part of the legitimate, albeit vulnerable, process.
Exactly. It's there, ready to use.
Okay, so let's talk user experience then. For the operator, the person doing this, their experience in this initial phase one is all about that pre-breach work reconnaissance, finding the vulnerability, executing the exploit.
The hard part, often.
Yeah, gaining that crucial initial foothold. And then, while that temporary session is active, they manually use these live, in-memory tools, or maybe those inherent shells, to explore the target environment, confirm they have reliable code execution, gather basic info, and basically demonstrate their level of access. Their interaction is all manual commands typed into that temporary session.
That's right. They are actively driving the system through this ephemeral connection. And what's automatically managed in this phase is primarily the inherent nature of these temporary tools and shells themselves. Meaning the operating system, just by default, does not automatically save the state or the existence or the activity of these tools or shells once the process they were running in terminates, or the session ends, or the system undergoes a reboot.
They just vanish from RAM.
They simply vanish from the computer's RAM. The cleanup is automatic because, well, there was never anything persistent to clean up on the disk in the first place.
Which leads us perfectly into phase two, the persistence decision point. Okay, this sounds like where things get really serious.
It is indeed a critical pivot point in this entire workflow. This phase explicitly represents a crucial branching path. The whole structure of the rest of the engagement, at least regarding maintaining access, it all hinges on the decision made right here.
And that decision isn't just up to the operator, right? It's driven entirely by the engagement scope and client permissions.
Absolutely. Red teams operate under very specific pre-agreed rules of engagement with the client. Those rules detail exactly what they are and, just as importantly, what they are not allowed to do.
Okay.
The C2 frameworks make it abundantly clear this decision is not the operator's personal preference. It's dictated by those predefined, often contractual rules. And based on those rules, there are basically two fundamental possible outcomes at this decision point.
All right, path number one. What happens if persistence is not allowed according to the rules?
If the rules of engagement explicitly prohibit establishing a long-term presence, then the operator's goal at this point shifts. It becomes a focused, temporary operation.
Okay.
Their objective becomes simply to show proof of access, extract data live, leave nothing. They use that initial access and the temporary live tools from phase one to quickly demonstrate the impact they could have, maybe extract any required data live over the network.
While the connection is active.
Exactly. And then they simply exit cleanly from the temporary session, ensuring absolutely no lasting trace remains on the system. Mission accomplished within the allowed scope.
So it's like that careful smash and grab approach.
Yeah.
Get in, do what you need while you're in, using only temporary tools, grab the necessary data live, and then vanish, leaving zero persistent artifacts behind.
Right. The emphasis is totally on temporary presence, achieving the mission objectives, demonstrating access, maybe data exfiltration purely through that initial access, and then executing a flawless artifact-free exit.
Okay. But what about the other path? What happens if persistence is allowed? If the scope explicitly permits establishing a more durable foothold?
Then, and only then, the workflow proceeds to the next phase, phase three, which is deploying a persistent implant.
Okay.
The specific implant chosen in this particular workflow, as detailed in the C2 frameworks, is a sliver implant for ongoing C2.
Sliver, got it.
This means establishing a foothold that is deliberately designed to survive disruptions like system reboots, ensuring continued access over potentially a longer period of time.
Okay, so for the user, the operator's experience at this persistence decision point is fundamentally one of evaluation and, well, compliance-based decision-making.
Yeah, they have to pause.
They pause their activity, they carefully review the constraints and permissions defined in those rules of engagement, and they make an explicit, conscious decision based only on those rules. Do we wrap up the engagement now by completing objectives temporarily and exiting cleanly, or do we proceed with planting a long-term persistent artifact?
Precisely. It's a critical checkpoint. It requires conscious confirmation based on the mission's legal and ethical boundaries,
Uh,
All is agreed upon beforehand with the client. No cowboy stuff.
right. Which naturally leads us straight into phase 3, implant deployment. And this phase, just to reiterate, is strictly conditional. It only happens if persistence got the green light back in phase 2.
Correct. The goal in this phase now is to establish that more durable command and control channel on the target system using the Sliver implant software. This implant will be the ongoing communication point back to the operator.
And the C2 frameworks lay out two main options for deploying this implant, and they're based specifically on how they interact with the target system's disk storage, right?
Yes, exactly. There's option A, memory only, and it's explicitly listed in the sources as the preferred method for safety.
Okay, preferred. Why is this memory-only approach the preferred one?
Well, it offers pretty significant advantages in terms of inherent stealth and, crucially, ease of cleanup later on. It uses a component called a sliver staker, which is typically delivered as either reflective dynamic link library code or maybe memory-only shellcode.
Okay, let's quickly break down those terms for anyone listening. What exactly is a dynamic link library, a DLL file, and what makes one reflective?
Sure. So a dynamic link library, a .dll file, is a standard type of file on Windows systems. It contains code and data that multiple programs can use simultaneously.
Like shared code libraries.
Exactly. Instead of every program having its own copy of, say, code to display a standard dialog box, they can all share one DLL. Normally, a program loads a needed DLL file from the disk into memory.
Okay.
A reflective dynamic link library, however, is specially crafted. Its code and data can be loaded and executed directly into a process's memory without ever needing to be written to or saved as a file on the disk first.
Ah, okay, so it bypasses the disk entirely.
Right. The stager or loader code, which you run first, essentially reads the DLL's contents, maybe from a remote source, like over the network connection you already have.
Right, from the initial access.
And then it executes that DLL code directly within the target process's RAM.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. The malicious code only exists in volatile memory, never as a file on the hard drive. So how do they actually get this memory-only stager or the shellcode onto the target in the first place, using that temporary session from phase 1?
The sources mention common delivery methods that leverage that temporary access. These include executing maybe a PowerShell one-liner command on a Windows target,
Okay, short PowerShell command.
or a Bash one-liner script on Linux systems, or maybe using a capability within the initial shell itself, which the sources refer to as an in-memory loader via initial shell.
So these are typically very short commands or maybe script snippets?
Yeah, tiny bits of code executed in that initial session. They reach out, fetch the actual stager code, and execute it directly into memory without touching the disk.
So the operator uses the Sliver C2 framework to generate the memory-only agent payload. Then, from their temporary shell on the target system, they execute one of these special commands. That command pulls the payload code over the network and runs it straight into the system's RAM.
Exactly. And the primary benefit here is incredibly significant for the overall goals of this workflow. No disk artifacts.
Right.
Because the implant code only resides in RAM, not as a file on the file system, well, reboot kills it. A simple restart of the target system is typically sufficient to completely remove the implant from memory.
That makes the cleanup process later sound incredibly low risk and simple if you can manage to get the target system rebooted somehow. It's automatically gone from memory.
It's a major, major advantage in terms of reliability and ease of cleanup. There are no files to delete, no registry keys to remove, no services to unregister related to the implant itself. It just evaporates.
Okay, so for the user, the operator's experience here is, first, they generate the memory-only agent using the Sliver C2 framework. Then they choose the right delivery command, like that PowerShell one-liner or a Bash one-liner script, depending on the target's operating system. And finally, they execute that command from their initial temporary shell to get the implant running inside a process's memory.
That's the process. And what is it automatically managed in this memory-only scenario?
Yeah, what does the system do?
The stager code, or that in-memory loader itself, handles the automation once it's executed by the operator. It automatically fetches the main implant code, injects it into the memory space of a target process. Often they'll choose a legitimate process to blend in better.
Right, hide inside something normal.
And executes it. From that point on, the Sliver implant runs entirely from the computer's volatile random access memory, managed by the OS, just like any other running code in memory. But crucially, without any corresponding files sitting on the hard drive.
Okay, that's the preferred memory-only approach. What about option B, controlled disk implant? This definitely sounds less stealthy right off the bat.
It is inherently less stealthy, at least in terms of leaving a file artifact. And it's specifically used when longer-term persistence across reboots is an explicit requirement of the engagement and, crucially, explicitly allowed by those client permissions we talked about.
Can't stress that enough.
Definitely. This option involves dropping the full sliver implant binary to disk.
So an actual file sitting on the hard drive this time, that binary would be what, an executable file, like a .eaxe file for Windows?
Right, a .exe for Windows, or an executable and linkable format file, typically with a .elf extension, .l for Linux systems.
Okay, so you're placing a file onto the target's file system. And how do you make sure it runs automatically after a reboot?
Persistence is established using standard built-in operating system mechanisms. On Windows, that's typically configuring Windows scheduled tasks.
Like telling Windows to run this program every time the computer starts.
Exactly. Or maybe when a user logs in or on a specific schedule. On Linux, it's commonly done using system services or similar init systems that manage processes during boot and runtime.
Got it. These are legitimate ways the operating system is designed to run programs automatically based on schedules or events.
Precisely. The operator configures these legitimate OS features to launch their malicious binary. But, and this is critical, to counter the inherent risk of leaving a file on disk and configuring a scheduled task or service, there's a vital technique employed here: obfuscation.
Ah, making it look like something it's not, trying to hide in plain sight.
Yes. The sources highlight that a crucial part of this approach is carefully naming both the scheduled task or service and the dropped implant binary file itself to resemble legitimate system components.
Okay, give me some examples.
They give examples in the sources like, for instance, naming a Windows scheduled task Google Update task. Sounds plausible, right?
Yeah, sounds totally normal.
Or maybe naming a Linux system service cups printer related to printing services. And critically, naming the binary file itself something innocuous like updatehelper.exe for Windows, or maybe just agent for Linux.
Ah, clever. So if a defender is maybe manually browsing through the list of scheduled tasks or looking at the running services or even just listing files in common system directories, these names might not immediately scream malicious because they sound and look like things you genuinely expect to find in a normal system.
Exactly. It's camouflage at the file system and OS configuration level.
It helps the implant and its persistence mechanism blend in during basic system checks and, manual inspection, makes detection harder than if you just dropped a file named, I don't know, sliver.exe or created a task named evil malware runner.
Definitely raises the bar for detection.
So for the user, the operator's experience with a disk-based implant involves a few distinct steps. First, they generate the disk-based agent, that binary file, the .exe or .elf using the Sliver C2 framework. Then they have to actually transfer that executable file onto the target system's disk.
Yep. Get it over there somehow.
After that, they manually, or maybe using a script, configure an operating system feature like creating a Windows scheduled task, or writing a Linux system service file to ensure that dropped binary gets executed automatically later.
Right, setting up the auto run.
And a really critical part of this step is also manually choosing and applying those obfuscated, legitimate-sounding names for both the task or service and the binary file itself.
That's right. They are actively interacting with the target's file system and the operating system's configuration mechanisms to establish this durable persistence and what's automatically managed in this disk-based scenario.
Yeah.
It's the operating system's built-in scheduler or service manager. Once the operator has configured it using those legitimate mechanisms, task scheduler systemed, the OS itself automatically launches the implant binary whenever the configured trigger or schedule is met, like system startup or recurring time or maybe a user login.
So the OS is basically tricked into running the malicious code automatically because it was configured via a legitimate method and uses those sneaky, obfuscated names.
Exactly. It's leveraging the system's own features against itself.
Okay, we've covered getting the implant onto the system either temporarily in memory or persistently on disk with obfuscation. Now let's talk about phase 4, C2 network design. This phase sounds like it really holds the key to that modern style of stealth communication mentioned in the C2 frameworks.
It absolutely does. This phase is really a cornerstone of this entire workflow, and it's specifically designed to solve major challenges faced by, traditional C2 setups in the current cybersecurity landscape.
Which is increasingly dominated by central cloud services and pretty sophisticated network monitoring, right?
Exactly. That's the environment this is built for.
And the sources describe this with a specific architecture, a kind of multi-hop design.
Yes. The crucial path the traffic takes is target system, sliver implant, HTTPS beacon, Cloudflare worker, EPKS C2 server.
Okay, let's trace that. Implant on the target sends an HTTPS beacon to a Cloudflare worker, which then talks to the actual C2 server on a VPS.
Precisely. The command and control traffic originates from the implant on the target, and it travels through each of those steps sequentially to reach the actual C2 server controlled by the operator.
So the compromised system, the target machine, it doesn't talk directly to the server the operator controls. It talks to this Cloudflare worker thing in the middle, and that forwards the traffic.
Exactly. And this specific design is where it fundamentally solves several big problems compared to a more, let's say, traditional approach, where a malicious implant might simply connect directly across the internet to the C2 server's public IP address.
Okay, let's break down those problems that this multi-hop setup solves, especially by leveraging cloud infrastructure like Cloudflare. What's problem number one?
Okay, the first major problem with direct connections is pretty obvious. The public IP address of your C2 server infrastructure is immediately exposed to the target network's defenses,
Right, they see the IP you're connecting to.
which makes it super easy for defenders to identify that IP, block it at the firewall, and potentially use that IP address to trace back or investigate the infrastructure and maybe even attribute it to the operator.
That's a huge operational risk, right? Your infrastructure gets burned, your whole operation might get shut down really quickly.
It is. The solution in this modern workflow is that the Cloudflare worker acts as a proxy or relay.
Okay, a middleman.
Yeah. The sliver implant running on the target machine is configured to communicate only with the Cloudflare worker's URL. The worker, which is running on Cloudflare's massive, extensive global network, receives this incoming traffic and then it forwards it to the real sliver C2 server. And that server is listening, maybe on a hidden or non-standard port, on a disposable virtual private server, a VPS.
So the key strategic difference here is that the target system never directly connects to the VPS. That's the big takeaway.
That's the major differentiator from traditional direct connections. The target system only ever initiates connections out to Cloudflare infrastructure, because that's where the worker is hosted.
And Cloudflare IPs are generally trusted, or at least common.
Right. This effectively hides the real IP address and the location of the actual C2 server behind Cloudflare's massive, legitimate network infrastructure. So defenders on the target network, they just see traffic going to Cloudflare, which happens all the time for legitimate reasons, not to the operator's specific suspicious VPS IP address.
Okay, problem solved for hiding the server's IP. Makes it much harder to block or trace directly from the target network's perspective. What's the next challenge this design solves?
Problem number 2. Purchasing a dedicated domain name for your C2 infrastructure. That can sometimes be linked back to the operator, maybe through domain registration information. Even if you use privacy services, there's always a potential trail.
Right, domain registration databases exist, WHOIS lookups. It can be a source of information for investigators.
The solution integrated into this workflow is both clever and aligns perfectly with that disposable philosophy we keep mentioning, using the freeworkers.dev subdomain.
Ah, the subdomain provided by Cloudflare for their worker service.
Exactly. This eliminates the need for the operator to purchase and register a dedicated domain name entirely. They simply use a subdomain provided by Cloudflare's worker service, something like my-sneaky-c2.workers.dev. This provides a disposable, high-reputation URL that's much harder to link directly back to the operator's personal identity or their typical online presence.
Using a subdomain provided by a massive, trusted service that hosts millions and millions of legitimate things. That makes total sense for blending in and disposability.
Exactly. Okay, problem 3. Malicious C2 traffic itself often has distinct patterns that security monitoring tools are specifically designed to detect.
Right, like connecting on weird ports or having super predictable, repetitive communication timings.
Like beaconing exactly every 60 seconds, 24/7. That stands out compared to normal, more varied user traffic patterns.
Yeah, humans aren't usually that regular.
Right. The solution here is kind of twofold. First, the implant communication uses HTTPS beacon traffic. And second, it's directed to the Cloudflare worker, because the implant is talking over HTTPS, the standard protocol for secure web browsing.
Port 443 again, usually.
Usual. And it's talking to a URL on Cloudflare's network. To source the state, this setup ensures that traffic appears to be communicating with a legitimate cloud service, Cloudflare.
Because, well, millions of legitimate websites and services use Cloudflare for their infrastructure, CDNs, security. Traffic going to Cloudflare is completely normal network activity in any organization.
Precisely. This makes the malicious C2 traffic more difficult to distinguish from normal network activity for defenders who might be looking for suspicious destination IPs or non-standard ports.
The sources also mentioned that using a content delivery network, a CDN like Cloudflare effectively scrubs traffic between the implant and the real VPS C2 server. It can strip some identifying characteristics, normalizes headers maybe, further aiding in blending in with generic CDN traffic.
So it doesn't just hide the destination IP, it actually makes the traffic itself look less suspicious by routing it through a service that handles just vast amounts of legitimate web traffic.
Yeah.
It's camouflage for the traffic's appearance and its destination.
And finally, problem number 4. What happens if your C2 infrastructure, like the VPS server, or maybe even the proxy itself, gets detected or compromised by defenders? You need to be able to replace it quickly to maintain access, right? Yeah, traditional server setups can sometimes take time to provision, configure securely. That creates downtime. Maybe you lose access.
The solution here aligns perfectly with the disposable philosophy of this whole workflow. Cloudflare workers are inherently disposable and can be easily rotated or replaced in minutes.
Wow, minutes.
You can spin up a new worker URL, maybe point it to the same backend or a new backend, and redirect traffic almost instantly. Similarly, the VPS hosting the actual Sliver C2 framework is intended to be a burner server, cheap, easily replaceable, and not containing sensitive long-term operational data.
Just the C2 listener, basically.
Right. This disposable nature of the infrastructure components provides really high resilience. If one part of the chain is compromised or blocked, you can quickly spin up a new one, maybe update the implant configuration if needed, and direct the implants to the new address, minimizing disruption to the operation.
That's a huge strategic advantage for maintaining access over a potentially long engagement. Much more agile than having to build and secure a traditional static server setup.
And what's truly fascinating about this whole phase, I think, is how it leverages these legitimate, widely used cloud services infrastructure that businesses and individuals trust and rely on every single day, and it turns them into incredibly effective tools for stealth and resilience in malicious operations. It really weaponizes ubiquity.
Weaponizing ubiquity. I like that. Okay, let's trace that multi-hop communication flow one more time just to make sure we've got it absolutely clear in our heads.
Okay. Starting at the target system, the Sliver implant initiates an encrypted HTTPS beacon. This is essentially a regular web request like your browser makes.
Okay.
But instead of going to a typical website, it's directed specifically to the Cloudflare worker URL. This URL will be that workers.dev subdomain the operator has set up, something like https.uniquename.workers.devapi or whatever path they configure.
So the implant's only outbound contact point is this specific URL sitting on Cloudflare's massive network.
Right. That HTTPS beacon traffic hits one of Cloudflare's many global edge locations. The Cloudflare worker code, which the operator wrote, and the sources mention it's often just a few lines of JavaScript, may be configured using a tool like Wrangler.
Okay, pretty simple code.
Yeah, minimal. That code executes when the request arrives at the edge. This worker code then receives the request and essentially acts as that proxy or relay we talked about. It forwards that traffic securely over the internet to the real Sliver C2 server that the operator has running on their disposable VPS. And that server is probably listening on a non-standard or hidden port for added obscurity.
And the sources also mentioned a slight alternative, right? Where the worker doesn't just proxy, but could actually host encrypted commands itself for the implant to pull down.
Yes, that's a variation on the theme. Instead of the worker just blindly forwarding the beacon and receiving the response directly from the C2, the implant might send a beacon, and the worker itself responds with pre-staged encrypted commands it has stored. The implant then decrypts and executes those commands.
So the C2 server might just be used to upload commands to the worker occasionally.
Could be. But either way, whether it's direct proxying or command hosting, both methods rely on the worker as that critical, stealthy intermediary point. It sits between the implant and the real C2 server, fundamentally hiding the VPS IP from the target.
Okay, so let's talk user experience again. For the operator, setting up the C2 network sounds complex, but obviously crucial. They need to, 1, set up the disposable VPS server. 2, install and configure the open source Sliver C2 framework on it, making sure it's listening correctly, possibly on a weird port. 3, configure and publish the Cloudflare worker code using something like Wrangler, writing that minimal JavaScript snippet, making sure it correctly receives incoming implant traffic, heading their chosen workers.dev URL, and proxies it accurately to their VPS.
Right, got to get the plumbing right.
And finally, 4, they generate the sliver implant payload configured specifically to beacon only to that Cloudflare worker URL they just set up. And I guess they also need to manage the keys or tokens used for the encrypted communication between the implant and sliver, regardless of the exact proxy method used.
That's a significant infrastructure setup phase for the operator, definitely requires care and testing. What's automatically managed is the core process once it's all configured correctly.
Okay, what parts run themselves?
The sliver implant software running on the target automatically handles initiating those HTTPS beaconing requests at the programmed intervals. And crucially, it includes the configured random jitter to help evade pattern detection.
Okay, the jitter is automatic based on settings.
Right. The Cloudflare worker service, running out there on Cloudflare's global network, automatically receives incoming requests hitting its published URL and executes the operator's configured proxy code to forward them to the VPS.
Cloudflare handles the worker execution.
Yep. The VPS runs the Sliver C2 listener, automatically waiting for those connections forwarded by the worker. And the standard HTTPS or TLS protocol itself automatically handles the encryption of the traffic, end-to-end ideally, ensuring the contents of the commands and responses are hidden from casual network inspection.
Okay, got it. So we've gained access, potentially established persistence, memory, or disk, and built this super stealthy, resilient communication channel using Cloudflare workers. Now, the final phase, but one that's absolutely non-negotiable for any kind of pro-level operation, Phase 5, the cleanup process.
Yeah, the C2 frameworks place extreme emphasis on the critical importance of cleanup. It is described flat out as essential to remove all traces from the compromised system. The explicit, really demanding goal is to leave no trace, simulating a scenario where the blue team finds nothing after the operation is totally complete.
Because if you leave anything behind a leftover file, a weird log entry, a forgotten scheduled task, the entire operation's stealth is immediately compromised. You've basically left evidence.
Exactly. Evidence that can lead to detection, attribution, and maybe worse, allow defenders to improve their defenses specifically based on the breadcrumbs you left behind. A failed cleanup can basically undo weeks or months of careful planning and execution.
Makes sense. So the cleanup process, as the sources outline it, differs significantly based on which type of implant was deployed way back in Phase 3, right? Memory versus disk?
Absolutely. Let's start with the easier one. If the memory-only implant was used, the one preferred for safety,
Yeah.
this is where that preferred for safety aspect really pays off dividends in the exit phase.
Yeah.
The cleanup is, well, remarkably simple. No cleanup needed, reboot done.
Just reboot.
Yep. Because the implant code only ever resided in the target system's volatile random access memory and was never written to the disk, a simple restart of the target system is sufficient to entirely wipe the implant from memory. Poof, gone.
That's incredibly clean. So if you can somehow trigger or just wait for a system reboot, your cleanup is automatically handled by the fundamental nature of the operating system's memory management.
It's a massive benefit for ease and, importantly, reliability of cleanup. There are no files you need to remember to delete, no registry keys to scrub, no services to unregister related to the implant itself. It just evaporates when the power cycles or the OS restarts.
Okay, simple enough. But if the disk-based implant was used back in Phase 3, the one where you dropped a file and set up a task, that sounds like a much more complex cleanup situation.
It requires a deliberate, scripted, and highly reliable process. First thing, the implant software itself must support remote kill.
Meaning the operator can tell it to shut down remotely?
Exactly. The sources confirm Sliver does support this capability. This allows the operator to issue a command through the established C2 channel to gracefully stop the malicious implant process remotely before they attempt to remove its artifacts. You don't want to be deleting a file while it's still running.
Right. Shut down the running program first. Makes sense.
Yes. And critically, an uninstall script ready is absolutely necessary. This is not something the operator improvises on the fly at the end of an engagement.
No way.
This script must be pre-prepared and thoroughly tested before the operation even reaches the deployment phase. You need your exit strategy planned and verified before you even commit to putting something persistent on disk.
Okay, and what specific steps does this uninstall script need to perform to achieve that really ambitious leave nothing goal based on the examples the sources give for, say, a Windows PowerShell script, a .ps1 file, or a Linux script, a .she file?
The script needs to systematically go through and remove all the traces left behind by that disk-based deployment. First, it must remove scheduled task service.
Okay, undo the persistence mechanism.
Right. This means using operating system commands like unregister scheduled tasks on Windows, or maybe systemtil stop, then systemtil disable, and finally systemtil R on Linux systems to first disable the mechanism that was set up in phase 3 to provide persistence, and then remove its configuration entirely.
Okay, disabling and removing the automatic start method. Got it.
Next, obviously, it must delete binary. This involves removing the actual implant executable file, .des or .elf, from the disk using standard file deletion commands like remove item on Windows or arm on Linux. You have to get rid of the file itself.
Obvious but absolutely essential step.
Yep. Then the script should also attempt to clear logs. The sources specifically mentioned targeting relevant system logs. On Windows, this might include trying to clear the security, system, and application event logs using commands like webtootslel.
Okay, wiping the standard Windows event logs.
On Linux, it means clearing various relevant logs depending on the system configuration, maybe audit logs, system logs like syslog or journaled logs. This step is crucial to remove evidence of the implant running, its activities, or even the cleanup script's own actions, if possible.
Removing the digital footprint, the forensic trail left in the logs.
And finally, the script should clear bash PowerShell history. This means using commands like history-c in bash or clearing the specific PowerShell history file to remove the commands the operator might have typed during the initial deployment of the binary, or while setting up persistence, or even while running the cleanup script itself.
Because you don't want your own commands sitting there in the command history for a defender to find later?
Exactly. Don't leave a record of how you cleaned up.
Wow, okay. That's a really meticulous checklist. It's clearly designed to cover the common places forensic investigators look for evidence. It really emphasizes that simulate blue team finds nothing goal.
And because cleanup logic can be surprisingly complex, you're interacting with core operating system components. Maybe under weird conditions, the sources stress a critical, non-negotiable requirement. Always test this process thoroughly in your lab environment beforehand.
Test, test, test.
You must be certain your cleanup script works perfectly and removes everything you intend it to, without breaking anything else, before you ever rely on it in a real engagement. A broken cleanup script is a nightmare scenario.
Yeah, I can imagine. So for the user, the operator's experience during the cleanup phase is quite different depending on the initial choice back in phase 3. For a memory-only implant, their role might simply be to trigger or maybe just request a system reboot if that's possible within the engagement scope.
Pretty hands-off, potentially.
Right. But for a disk-based implant, they need to actively issue a remote kill command via the sliver C2 channel to stop the running implant process. Then, they execute that pre-tested uninstall script on the target system to perform the file deletion, persistence removal, and log history clearing. They are responsible for ensuring that script runs successfully and, if possible, maybe even verifying that the traces are actually gone.
Correct. Much more active cleanup role. And what's automatically managed during cleanup? Well, the remote kill command is processed by the running implant software itself, telling it to terminate gracefully. The uninstall script, once it's successfully executed by the operator, then interacts automatically with the operating system services like the task scheduler or system, the file system, and the logging mechanisms to perform the removal steps as they were coded into the script.
So the OS itself doesn't magically clean up the malicious artifacts from disk?
No, absolutely not. The script has to explicitly tell the operating system precisely what to remove and where to remove it from.
Got it. This brings us neatly to the OPSEC notes, which, as we discussed earlier, isn't really a single phase you complete, but more like a mindset and a set of practices that have to run through every single step of this entire workflow.
Constant vigilance.
And the C2 frameworks pull together a lot of absolutely critical points here for operational security.
Operational security, OPSEC, is just paramount in this kind of stealth operation. If your OPSEC fails at any point, even if your technical execution and tools are perfect, the entire stealth workflow can be compromised.
Leading to
detection, maybe blocking of your expensive or carefully crafted infrastructure, or, worst case, attribution back to you as the operator.
Right. Let's break down these OPSEC considerations by category, as the sources seem to do. First, infrastructure OPSEC securing the stuff you control.
Okay, key point number 1, how you actually pay for and acquire your infrastructure. The sources state very clearly, use VPS paid via crypto or trusted third party, not your personal card.
Absolutely fundamental.
Yeah, this is basic tradecraft for preventing financial tracing back to your real identity. Your VPS is a burner, specifically because it's disposable and it's isolated from your real life, including your finances.
Makes complete sense. You do not want your credit card statement linking you directly to the server hosting your C2 operations.
Key point number 2 applies the same exact logic to that really stealthy component, the Cloudflare worker. Use Cloudflare worker on burner Cloudflare account, new email, no phone tie if possible.
Okay, a whole separate burner account just for Cloudflare.
Yes. You need a disposable Cloudflare account specifically for this operation, ideally registered with a brand new email address not tied to you, and, if possible, without linking a phone number. Again, the goal is to prevent that account from being linked back to your real identity or your normal online presence. It's another layer of burner infrastructure.
Again, breaking any direct link to the operator's real-world identity or online footprint.
And the third infrastructure point reinforces that core C2 network design we spent time on. Use VPS, behind worker never beacon, direct to VPS IP.
Critical rule.
This is a critical OPSEC requirement that flows directly from Phase 4. You must ensure the implant is configured only to talk to the Cloudflare worker URL, never ever directly to the actual IP address of the VPS hosting the Sliver C2 server. This is absolutely crucial for hiding the real server location and maintaining the whole benefit of that proxy architecture. Don't mess that up.
Okay, that's the infrastructure layer of OPSEC covered. What about the implant characteristics OPSEC? Features the implant software itself needs to support for good OPSEC.
Right. The implant software, in this case the source's focus on Sliver, needs to have certain features built in that aid in stealth and security. For example, it should use a per-implant ID token.
Okay, what's that for?
It's mainly for securely managing multiple deployed agents. If you've compromised several machines, each implant should have a unique identifier. This ensures that traffic from one compromised system isn't confused with another, and it provides a basic layer of authentication. The C2 server knows which implant it's talking to.
Like a unique session identifier for each machine you've successfully implanted.
Pretty much. Also, encrypted comms are absolutely essential. The sources state plainly the implant must use HTTPS.
Right, secure web traffic.
This reinforces the use of standard encrypted web traffic, usually over port 443. By encrypting the actual command and control data payload within the HTTPS connection, it becomes much harder for network defenders using packet inspection tools to understand what the implant is actually doing or what commands are being sent, compared to, say, unencrypted traffic over HTTP or some other protocol.
Blending in again by using an encrypted tunnel over a very common web port.
Another key characteristic, especially for evading detection by network monitoring tools, is implementing random beacon jitter in intervals.
We touched on beacon jitter during the C2 network design phase, phase 4, but let's quickly explain it again and really emphasize why it's so important for OPSEC.
Right. So beacon jitter, as we said, is about adding random variation to the timing of the implant's check-ins with the C2 server. Instead of, say, sending a beacon exactly every 60 seconds like perfect clockwork.
Which looks very machine-like.
Very machine-like. The implant might be configured with, say, a 20% jitter. This means its next beacon could happen anywhere between 48 seconds, 60 minus 20%, and 72 seconds, 60 plus 20%, after the last one. The timing varies randomly within a defined range.
So varying the time slightly with each check-in, never exactly the same interval?
Correct. And the sources explain why this random variation is crucial for OPSEC. It makes the traffic pattern less predictable and therefore harder for security monitoring systems to identify as malicious command and control activity.
Because those security systems are specifically designed to spot those unnatural, machine-like, regular pulses of activity.
Exactly. They look for that heartbeat. Compared to perfectly regular intervals, which are often easily flagged by automated security tools looking for common command and control patterns, jitter makes the communication timing look more organic, less automated, and helps it blend into the natural variations and noise of legitimate network traffic.
So because security systems are tuned to spot those machine-like regular pulses, jitter makes the pulse irregular and harder to flag automatically. Clever.
Very effective. The sources also mention the value of having an optional backup C2 list configured within the implant.
For resilience.
Exactly. This is a resilience measure. If the primary C2 infrastructure, maybe the worker URL, or even the backend VPS is taken down or blocked by defenders, the implant can automatically attempt to contact secondary or tertiary C2 addresses specified in this backup list.
Giving the operator a chance to regain control via alternative infrastructure if the main channel goes dark.
Precisely. It builds in some fault tolerance.
Okay. And finally, the process-level OPSEC. What does that cover?
This loops right back to Phase 5, the cleanup. Cleanup scripts must be tested, fully simulate. Blue team finds nothing. This just reinforces again the critical importance of having a tested, reliable exit strategy. A failed cleanup is a major OPSEC failure that exposes the entire operation and potentially the tools and techniques used.
Right. Don't fumble the exit. So, putting it all together for the user, the operator's experience here is really one of rigorous discipline and constant attention to detail during both the setup and the execution phases. They are personally responsible for implementing all of these OPSEC measures correctly.
It's on them.
This means carefully setting up and paying for infrastructure according to these principles, configuring the sliver implant with the correct URLs, beacon intervals, jitter levels, and encryption settings, and crucially, ensuring their cleanup scripts are developed and thoroughly tested beforehand. Adherence to these OPSEC notes isn't just, good practice. It's absolutely crucial for their own operational safety and the long-term success and stealth of the operation.
It really is the difference between a sophisticated, low-profile operation that might go undetected for a long time and one that's quickly detected, shut down, and potentially analyzed. And what's automatically managed regarding OPSEC.
Yeah.
It's primarily the features built into the sliver implant software itself once they've been configured correctly by the operator. The implant automatically handles implementing the configured jitter, using its unique per-implant ID or token for communication authentication, initiating the HTTPS encryption for the comms, and automatically attempting connections to backup C2s if the primary one fails, all based on the operator's initial setup parameters.
Okay, so the tool handles the execution of the OPSEC features, but the operator has to configure them perfectly. This is clearly a pretty sophisticated stack of technology and a very disciplined methodology overall. What are the essential tools and services, the key components listed in the C2 frameworks that make this entire workflow possible?
Yeah, the sources provide a pretty clear list of the core building blocks that comprise this modern workflow stack.
Okay, first, the central piece of software for actually managing the whole operation.
That's the C2 framework itself, specifically naming Sliver, which the sources also note is open source. This is the primary tool the operator interacts with to generate the implant payloads, configure their behavior, receive connections back from the compromised systems, and issue commands to the deployed agents.
The command center. Then the critical component that enables that really stealthy communication architecture we discussed.
That's the CDN proxy. And in this specific workflow detailed in the sources, it's the Cloudflare worker. This is that crucial intermediary layer that hides the real C2 server and makes the C2 traffic look like legitimate cloud activity.
Yeah. And the server where the actual C2 framework sliver runs and listens for connections.
That's the VPS, described simply as a cheap VPS. The sources even mention examples of providers like Hetzner or Volter. This is that disposable burner server, designed to be easily spun up and torn down, and importantly, easily replaced if it gets compromised or detected.
Okay. The initial way onto the target system in the first place.
That's listed somewhat generically as initial access, your method of choice. This workflow is designed to kick in after you've already gained that initial temporary code execution back in phase 1. It doesn't prescribe the specific exploit method itself, acknowledging that can vary widely depending on the target and the situation.
So bring your own exploit.
Basically, yes. And the actual code that establishes and maintains presence on the target system after that initial access.
The implant itself.
Right. That's the persistence provided by the sliver agent. This is the actual code payload running on the compromised machine, whether it's the preferred memory-only version or the more durable disk-based binary, the .x or .elf file.
And finally, the necessary component for making a clean exit at the end.
That's the cleanup, described as manual or scripted uninstall. This is the process, potentially involving those custom, pre-tested scripts needed to remove all traces, especially if a disk-based implant was used.
So these components, Sliver C2, Cloudflare Worker, Burner VPS, your initial access method, the Sliver agent, and the cleanup process, they all work together in concert. From getting that first temporary foothold through the stealthy multi-hop C2 communication using the worker, all the way to the final meticulous cleanup to achieve the workflow's core goals of stealth, disposability, and resilience.
Exactly. It's a carefully chosen set of tools, specifically enabling a very deliberate methodology. Each piece plays a vital, interconnected role in enabling the sophisticated operational security and overall effectiveness described in the C2 frameworks.
Speaking of effectiveness, the sources wrap up by listing some big benefits that really highlight why this modern worker-based approach is often preferred over older or maybe more direct C2 methods.
Yeah, these are the major strategic advantages you gain by adopting this kind of workflow. First is significant OPSEC benefit we already touched on. No domain risk.
Right. Because you're using a free workers.dev subdomain provided by Cloudflare, which isn't tied back to the operator through registration databases like a custom registered domain name potentially could be.
Right. It's inherently more disposable and anonymous in that specific sense. Second, a major win for infrastructure OPSEC and resilience. No direct VPS exposed to target C2 behind worker.
Which, as we discussed, makes it dramatically harder for defenders on the target network to discover the real IP address of your command server, and therefore much harder to block or trace your backend infrastructure.
Third, related specifically to the Cloudflare worker component. Easy rotation of workers.dev can burn and replace in minutes. This really emphasizes the disposability and the agility of that front-end infrastructure. If a specific worker URL gets detected or blocked, you can very quickly set up a new one, maybe point it to the same back-end VPS, and redirect implants, potentially maintaining your access with minimal interruption.
So if one door closes, you can open a new door almost instantly using the same underlying Cloudflare platform, much faster than provisioning a whole new server.
Definitely. And finally, a benefit specific to the chosen C2 framework mentioned in the sources. Slever is modern URI supports all needed tricks. This just speaks to the capability of the tool itself to implement the features essential for this kind of sophisticated workflow, like supporting HTTPS comms, built-in beacon jitter options, reflective loading, and remote kill functionality for cleanup.
So these benefits, no domain risk, hidden VPS, easy rotation, capable tool, they collectively paint a picture of a red team operation that is significantly more stealthy, much more resilient against detection and infrastructure takedown, and generally more OPSEC aware than older methods that might involve implants connecting directly to a public IP or relying on more easily identifiable static infrastructure.
They directly address and mitigate many of the common points of failure and detection that defenders are actively looking for when hunting for C2 communications in their networks.
Okay, wow. That was a seriously deep dive into the mechanics and philosophy of this modern C2 workflow. Now, let's take a step back and connect this back to you, the listener. Why is understanding this kind of methodology valuable to you, whether you happen to work in cybersecurity or you're just trying to understand the complexities of the digital world?
Well, this workflow, as described in the C2 frameworks, is really a prime example of how modern digital threats and, frankly, sophisticated actors are evolving their techniques. They are prioritizing stealth above almost everything else.
Using things like memory-only implants, obfuscation.
Exactly. And they're leveraging common trusted infrastructure like CDNs and cloud services, think Cloudflare, workers.dev for malicious purposes,
Hiding in plain sight.
hiding in plain sight. And they're building in disposability and resilience into their operations right from the ground up, using things like burner infrastructure and designing for easy rotation.
So even if you're not actually doing these kinds of operations, just seeing how it works from the inside gives you crucial insight into what modern defenders are up against. This kind of advanced digital camouflage hiding within trusted, legitimate services that everybody uses presents a really significant challenge for detection.
Absolutely. If you are involved in cybersecurity defense, maybe you're a blue teamer, understanding this workflow is, I'd argue, absolutely essential knowledge
Why essential?
because it helps you anticipate the techniques adversaries are likely using right now. It helps you know what subtle indicators of compromise or IOCs to look for, recognizing that seemingly normal HTTPS traffic going out to a cloud service like Cloudflare might actually be hiding something malicious underneath. And ultimately, it helps you design more effective monitoring strategies, better detection rules, and defense postures that can hopefully see through this kind of camouflage.
Yeah, you really can't defend effectively against what you don't understand. Knowing the adversary's playbook, in this case, understanding how they try to hide their command and control, seems pretty foundational.
Exactly. But even if your primary role isn't directly in cybersecurity, this provides really valuable insight into the evolving nature of digital operations and the inherent challenges of policing online activity in the modern era.
How so?
It shows just how difficult it can be to detect hidden, potentially malicious activity when it's intentionally blended into the massive volumes of legitimate traffic flowing through these vast, trusted cloud services that we all rely on every single day for work and life. It offers a different perspective on the digital landscape we all inhabit, seeing it not just as users or maybe builders, but from the viewpoint of someone actively trying to operate unseen within it.
Yeah, it ties back to that idea of the learner persona we aim for, gaining knowledge quickly but thoroughly, finding those aha moments where you
Right.
suddenly see how seemingly unrelated pieces of technology like CDNs and serverless functions can be combined in really unexpected, potentially malicious ways. And understanding those different perspectives, the attackers versus the defender's view of the exact same cloud infrastructure.
It fundamentally shifts your perspective, or it should, on what seemingly normal network traffic might actually be concealing beneath the surface.
And the C2 frameworks we've been digging into also hinted that this core workflow we've discussed today is really just the foundation, right? There are even deeper layers and more advanced techniques that build on these core concepts.
Yes, absolutely. They listed several bonus topics as areas for further exploration, which really indicates just how deep this field goes and how the techniques are constantly evolving, often in direct response to new defenses.
Like what kind of advanced topics?
Well, things like achieving an even more sophisticated full Cloudflare worker plus TLS setup. This might involve using custom domains instead of the generic workers.dev, making the implant believe it's talking to a totally legit website, which could make the camouflage even more convincing, especially against more advanced network analysis or man-in-the-middle inspection.
Pushing that blending in aspect even further, making it look even more legitimate.
Exactly. And also practical knowledge, like how to rotate workers.dev instances easily, showing the actual operational steps an operator takes to leverage that disposability and resilience. We
Mm.
talked about how do you actually burn and replace a worker on the fly,
Right, the mechanics of rotation.
and exploring more advanced implant loaders, basically. Different ways to get that initial memory-only stager or maybe the disk-based binary onto the target system stealthily in the first place. The sources mention techniques like using a macro embedded in an Office document, or a clever one-liner PowerShell command, a bash one-liner script for Linux, or perhaps a more complex multi-stage script dropper.
Just more ways to achieve that initial execution and delivery.
Right. These are all areas that refine and build upon the core workflow we discussed, adding more layers of sophistication, stealth, and resilience to the operation.
It definitely positions this whole area as a continually developing field of expertise, requiring constant learning just to keep up with the evolving techniques on both the attack and defense sides.
Absolutely. There's always more to learn. And the methods used in attack and defense are in this constant state of flux, this cat and mouse game.
Well, that was a truly fascinating look inside a modern professional level red team C2 workflow, as detailed in the C2 frameworks. We covered the structured, phased approach, starting from gaining that initial temporary access with absolutely no disk drops,
Critical first
to
steps.
the crucial persistence decision point, and then the two deployment options. The stealthy, easy cleanup memory-only approach using reflective dynamic link libraries versus the more durable disk-based option using an executable.exe or executable and linkable format .elf binary combined with careful obfuscation of file names and tasks.
And we really delve deep into that crucial C2 network design phase, seeing how the multi-hop architecture, specifically leveraging a Cloudflare worker as a proxy in front of a disposable burner VPS, solves fundamental problems of traceability and detection compared to traditional direct C2 connections.
Making malicious command and control traffic appear almost indistinguishable from normal, legitimate cloud activity flowing over standard HTTPS.
Right, and we reinforce the absolute necessity of the cleanup process, detailing the step-by-step requirements for cleaning up disk-based implants, using those pre-tested uninstall scripts to remove scheduled tasks or services, delete the binary file, clear relevant logs, and clear shell history.
And contrasted that complexity with the inherent simplicity of cleaning up a memory-only implant, which often just requires a system reboot.
And running through all of it, those non-negotiable OPSEC notes, covering disposable infrastructure paid for via crypto or third parties, using burner cloud accounts, the cardinal rule of never beaconing directly to the VPS IP, and ensuring crucial implant characteristics like encrypted HTTPS communication and random beacon jitter to defeat pattern analysis, alongside the critical importance of thoroughly testing your exit strategy, your cleanup scripts.
Yeah, it's a workflow built fundamentally on achieving stealth, ensuring disposability, maximizing resilience, and maintaining a highly disciplined, pro-level mindset focused entirely on operating unseen and leaving absolutely no trace behind.
A high standard to meet.
Definitely. So here's a provocative thought to leave you with today. In a digital landscape that is increasingly overwhelmingly reliant on vast, trusted cloud services and CDN's infrastructure that billions of users and countless businesses depend on and implicitly trust every single day, How do defenders effectively distinguish legitimate traffic flowing to and from these ubiquitous services from sophisticated, camouflaged, malicious activity that is specifically designed to hide in plain sight within that very same trusted infrastructure?
That's the multi-trillion-dollar question, isn't
But
it?
the techniques described today really highlight the immense and frankly growing challenge of hunting for threats that are deliberately designed to look just like the normal, everyday background noise of the modern internet. Something to think about.